the 12 signs of the zodiac, adopted in both Sumer and in Peru. The biggest oddity is why any ancient culture would adopt a scheme which tries to group the stars that they see in the constellations they see in the sky. Why divide it into a set of 12? The spirit, also known as our light, is associated with the left side of the brain. The soul, also known as our image, is associated with the right brain. It's the mind absorbing and emanating emotions. The soul contains all our memories. Welcome, folks. Welcome to the 25th episode of the Quintology Files. Today we've got a puzzle for you. The puzzling complexity of ancient theology. As far as we can find, all the oldest cultures seem to have shared a surprisingly sophisticated belief system, something which defies obvious explanations based on simplicity and geographical adjacency. In a previous episode, we looked at the legacy artifacts that have been recovered in Egypt, requiring manufacturing finishes impossible to achieve with the simple tools that those periods were associated with. I'm talking about the pharaonic dynasties from, say, 3200 BC up to the death of Cleopatra, 30 BC. Today, we'll look at other evidence, including surviving ancient inscriptions pointing to the existence of a widespread civilization, seemingly enjoying transoceanic trading, including Egypt to the Philippines, West Africa to Mexico. These are not short distances. So, we have the distinctive but common legends of a leader arriving with 7 helpers to assist post-disaster recovery. We have almost the same tale in ancient Egyptian records, Mesopotamian records, and Peruvian records. The similarity of the background circumstances point to these disasters having been caused by dramatic climatic change, earthquakes, tsunamis, darkness. And as we previously discussed, these are probably most likely attributable to major meteor impacts. So that gives us a time frame of roughly 17,000 BC to 10,000 BC, give or take. We also have the common features of the zodiac, the 12 signs of the zodiac, adopted in both Sumer and in Peru. The biggest oddity is why any ancient culture would adopt a scheme which tries to group the stars that they see in the constellations they see in the sky. Why divide it into a set of 12? That seems an amazing coincidence. Then we have the similarity of the symbols used to represent the different parts of the sky. Some of these are almost identical between the Peruvian or ancient Incan and the Mesopotamian, Sumerian symbols. The Inca legends ascribe the original founding of Cuzco to the time of Viracocha and his 7 wise men. The Inca stories of creation were so similar to Genesis that the Spanish conquistadors reported back to Spain that they had found some of the lost tribes of Israel. We also have the standard mummification ingredients used in Egypt. If you've watched that episode, we've been able to conclude that the standard recipe included extracts from bark and sap and plants unique to the Spice Islands and even the Philippines. And yet, this recipe was standardized centuries before the first pharaoh. We have evidence that what was used in 3600 BC is identical to what was used in 600 BC. It's absolutely extraordinary. We have the architectural and town planning features used in the Harappan civilization in northwest India, Pakistan, dating from around 3000 BC and surviving until around 1300 BC, identical to the Sumerian basic layout of urban settlements. We have the ploughing techniques still used today in Goa in India, which are identical to the ancient Sumerian techniques, same width, same style of ploughs, all pointing to a spread of culture or an exchange of ideas at the very least. Then we have the very distinctive African facial features of the Olmec giant carved heads all along the coastal areas of the Gulf of Mexico. These currently are dated to around 1500 BC. Personally, I find that date a bit puzzling, as there's no evidence either in West Africa or in Mexico of any transoceanic capabilities. If there had been a culture able to undertake oceanic travel at that time, you would have thought there'd be some records within the Mediterranean, but none. Although what one might contemplate on is the fact that, again, in an earlier episode, we looked at evidence that the myth of Atlantis was actually born out of a kernel of truth, in that a culture, possibly named Atlantis, existed in Mauritania in West Africa, but was wiped out around 9600 BC. So maybe there's a link between those that carved the Olmec heads in the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantean culture. Also, the events at that time, 10,000 BC, caused a significant rise in global average sea levels. So a maritime culture would naturally be based at sea level and is now 100 meters under the water. So there are a number of things there to sort of factor into consideration of a potential widespread culture, or at least trading between cultures on a very almost intercontinental level.
What do you conclude this evidence points to?
Well, I think there must have been a connected set of human cultures, not necessarily a dominant culture that had spread, but at least trading between cultures. But even more strange is the obscure belief system which seems to have been common across widely dispersed cultures. If one speculates, one could understand man's early theology being very much derived from what was personally experienced. A blaze of lights in the sky, a shooting star, even a meteorite. If something came from the sky and caused damage, that could easily be animated as a punishment from a deity for something that somebody had done wrong. Clearly, during the driest periods from 17,000 BC to 10,000 BC, there were maybe a dozen significant meteor impacts, and they gave rise to numerous legends and instilled great fear of the skies in most parts of the world. For hunter-gatherers, weather would be crucial. A tough winter meant no food. Droughts would also mean that wild foodstuffs would be poor quality. But for cultures based in settled communities, dependent upon farming, the food surplus created by a small part of the population to sustain the whole population, weather was absolutely vital. And variations, unexpected variations of the weather, you can understand why they looked around for someone to blame. Or they blame themselves for having done something, or their leaders would blame them for not having paid enough taxes or levies or whatever. So you can see how the generators of variation from the norm could easily be animated and become the deities.
Surely fears of the unknown, fears of danger from the skies, fear of the dark would lead to a search for explanation, for reassurance.
Absolutely. And one can imagine a type of theology that would come from that. Now it starts to get puzzling. It's interesting that so many cultures believed humans had a spiritual component, and some cultures extended this idea to include a few species of animals. For example, the Egyptians believed that certain cows with certain markings were reincarnation of a deity. Cats generally were a deity or had a spiritual component, and also ibis birds. But whilst one can understand perhaps that the powerful, the leaders, the favoured would claim to have a special force inside them, why would the existence of this special force extend also to the poor, to the weak, and the subjugated? That's quite sophisticated. And now comes a really stunning part. This widespread belief of a spiritual force indwelling in humans was not of a single force, but of two interdependent forces, which we would translate today as a soul and a spirit. If you stop and think about that, that's a very sophisticated concept. Moreover, the definition and the roles of these two forces are much the same, so far as we can derive from ancient writings, clearly defined in many cultures over a very wide geographical area. Nowadays, the terms soul and spirit are confused and used interchangeably. This is explained by a deliberate campaign by the Roman Church over many centuries to confuse people. But in ancient times, these concepts were very well defined and well understood. And as we can see here, looking at some of the oldest cultures that we know of, each one had a distinct term for the spirit and a distinct term for the soul. And the definitions of both were remarkably consistent. The spirit, also known as our light, is associated with the left side of the brain. It's supposed to represent a person's life force. It's our free will and intellect. Departure of the spirit from a human body equals death. The soul, also known as our image, is associated with the right brain. It's the mind absorbing and emanating emotions. The soul contains all our memories. The soul may have out-of-body experiences, and sometimes when we awake, we're able to recall them. Whilst this binary spiritual concept may sound alien to Catholics, unfamiliar to those of many other religions, and maybe a bit new age to atheists, actually it lies deep in the heritage of most cultures around the world. Indeed, the extent of the belief in our dual spiritual nature is very surprising. there's a common understanding shared throughout all these groups. The Egyptian civilization, various civilizations in Mesopotamia, in the Levant, in Iran, India, China, and the Greek culture. So it's not a one-off, it's actually an extremely common ancient idea. The Egyptian belief in the immortality of the soul existed millennia before Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. According to Herodotus, who's a 5th century writer, known as the father of history, the Greeks adopted the belief in the immortality of the soul from the Egyptians. Herodotus wrote, "The Egyptians were also the first who asserted the doctrine that the soul of man is immortal. This opinion, some among the Greeks have at different periods of time adopted as their own." Socrates travelled to Egypt to consult with Egyptians on their beliefs about immortality of the soul, and later imparted his teaching to Plato. Even the Inca in South America believed humans had a spiritual force which split into two at death. One part, the Camaquén, travelled a very difficult path to the next world, whilst the second part remained with the body and was preserved through mummification. In his book Original Christianity, a writer, Peter Novak, also identifies adherents of the binary spiritual doctrine amongst the native peoples right across the Eurasian landmass, North America, South America, and even Australia. Although personally I have not done any research on such beliefs in any of those geographical areas.
So, why and how could this belief in the spiritual duality have become adopted all around the world?
But for a belief that's not at all self-evident, it seems to have been culturally adopted in ancient times in all areas of the world. Does the evidence indicate that these native peoples were the remnants of an earlier global culture that somehow arrived at this belief in a dual spiritual existence within humans? Unsurprisingly, given its pervasive ancient acceptance, this idea remains embedded in major faiths today. Taking firstly the Abrahamic faiths, if we go through. So in Judaism, scripture is clear, with the soul and the spirit having very distinct roles and destinations. The Israelites believed that their spirit came from God and after death returned to God, but their souls went down into a deep, dark abyss where they were cut off. The soul was cut off from everything forever, even cut off from God. This eternal loss of existence, applying equally to the righteous and the wicked, was seen maybe as a bit unfair. So during a very troubled period, the Maccabean period, around the 2nd century BC, led to one of the newer Jewish movements, the Pharisees, adopting the, at that time, unique idea of bodily resurrection, which surprisingly they borrowed from the Persians. This was an article of the Zoroastrian faith. No one else believed in bodily resurrection. This effectively means that you get resurrected into your old dead body. Not that attractive, I don't think. Anyway, the other leading Jewish religious groups, the Sadducees and the Essenes, wouldn't have anything to do with this newfangled foreign nonsense. They maintained that the soul remained in Sheol forever. Interestingly, more modern view of rabbinical Judaism, very much promoted by Maimonides and building on the Pharisees' view, is of bodily resurrection. But the interesting thing is the nephesh, the soul, is gradually cleansed to remove impurities, and eventually, once it's clean, is released into Olam Haba, the world to come. It sounds like old bodies get reunited with sanitized minds. So let's look at Islam. Islam seems to have inherited the common Abrahamic belief of having a dual spiritual entity, using very similar words. The soul, nafs, close to nebesh, being the essence of our personality, our desires and emotions, and it's subject to judgment by God, and it may be cleaned in this process. The spirit, Ra, is of divine origin. It gives life to the person, it is not subject to judgment, and it has a mysterious nature known only to Allah. Obviously, a close similarity between Judaism and Islam. Christianity also shared these beliefs in the early days, but then it became more complicated. So let's first look at the other main non-Abrahamic faiths and then come back to Christianity, because that's a bit complicated.
So what about Buddhism, Hinduism and Shintoism?
Right. Well, in Hinduism, as far as I can tell, which dates back at least 4,000 years, there are similar beliefs. A central belief is that each person has a spiritual component. All strands of Hinduism believe in the Atman, an eternal force residing in each person, but without a centralized authority or set of beliefs. Hinduism has various traditions. Some, such as the Devalta and the Bhakti, believe in a dual spirituality with a distinct personal force connected to the divine. The Atman is seen as the spirit or the spark of God within us, full of wisdom, joy and peace. The Atman is believed to be immortal, unchanging, and able to endure beyond the physical body. The Atman is the witness of the individual's actions and experiences and may judge the individual after death. Shintoism, the main Japanese belief system, which dates back to the prehistoric, pre-literate period of Japanese history, also acknowledges people have a spiritual essence, the Tama. Again, this comprises two parts: the Kami, which is a sacred spirit found in all life forms, not just people, and the Matama, which is a personal spiritual force broadly equivalent to the soul. Individuals who have led an exemplary life may become a Kami in the afterlife. In Buddhism, founded by Siddhartha Gautama, the original Buddha, who achieved enlightenment in 528 BC, Gautama was a crown prince of the Shakya kingdom in Nepal and even ruled as king for a while. Buddhism is not normally seen as a religion so much as a lifestyle, but there's a broadly similar concept. The body is believed to hold 7 chakra, which are specified energy centers for non-material forces, i.e. spiritual forces. So, in conclusion, it seems all ancient cultures that we know about have a surprising understanding of humanity, that human beings comprised a body, and with only one exception, a body housing a 2-part spiritual component, a soul and a spirit. Not only that, but when you get into the detailed definitions, they all seem to share a common understanding of what a soul and a spirit represented. To me, that points to the prior existence of some kind of common culture almost globally.
Now let's discuss what the Christians believe.
As I warned, more complicated. In Christianity, the situation got confused. Initially, the same dualistic belief continued. In the year 381, under Emperor Theodosius I, we had the First Church Council of Constantinople, which confirmed that a human body combined both a soul and a spirit. However, about 500 years later, the Roman Church changed its view and decided to enforce dogma that humans house a single spiritual component. And in the year 869, again in Constantinople, the Fourth Church Council of Constantinople ruled that the binary spiritual existence of a soul and a spirit had been now declared heretical. To confuse Christians, the church started referring to a spiritual soul and ended up confusing everybody by using the terms spirit and soul completely interchangeably. But ordinary people retain their understanding, as evidenced by the sailors around the world will all shout, "Save our souls!" They know what the spirit does, and they know the spirit doesn't need to be saved. That's a very deep cultural heritage. Biblical translations from the Vulgate and the King James Version have acted to institutionalize the confusion. But today, most Protestant Christians still believe in the existence of both a soul and a spirit. But there's a lot of confusion because whilst the ancient definitions and understandings were clear, Jesus' descriptions of how the two may interact are complex and largely hidden because all the texts recording his views were ruled heretical and, wherever possible, all copies destroyed. Almost all English language Bibles are heavily influenced by the King James Version, so that today Christians are totally confused and mostly use the two terms interchangeably. If, however, they learnt Hebrew and read the Jewish texts, they would understand they're two very distinct components, the soul and the spirit, with distinct roles, and they would have a better understanding in line with ancient beliefs.
So what conclusion do you reach?
Well, from the evidence we have, it seems there's a widespread belief in a very obscure concept that humans not only had a spiritual, unseen, immaterial force within themselves, but they largely agreed on the technical details that we housed a binary spiritual force combining a soul and a spirit. To me, this is very profound. It points to a very widespread, if not worldwide, culture existing in prehistory that we know virtually nothing about. Only its religion has sort of survived, echoing down the eons. Now, in the next episode, we will look at how the early texts that the church decided were heretical reveal Jesus' teachings appeared to provide continuity with this ancient, widespread understanding. Thank you, folks. If you enjoyed this, please press the like button. Thank you.